now here in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, off a side street, and previously we discussed how to take a speed light and bounce that artificial light to get a flattering shot. So now I'm going to take this speed light off camera, which is going to allow a lot more control over the light and give me a more engaging shot. So before we power on this speed light, I'm going to take a shot in just natural light to show you what we're working with. So I've placed Claire here in a position where I think that these vertical lines are going to really play to her pose and play to her body. And we're just going to photograph this natural light. We're in the shade, so keep that in mind. Perfect. Chin up a little bit. Beautiful. Let's have your hand over the other. Yep. Great. Strong look. Perfect. Mouth open a little bit, chin up slightly. Beautiful. So I love natural light, especially in an environment like this where we're in shade and you don't have to control the sun. This is something I probably would deliver to a client if the elements from styling, hair, makeup, and the model all came together to make a really awesome shot. So I think we can make this shot a whole lot more interesting by bringing in some artificial light. So there are instances where a direct flash will work. I don't think it's going to work in this case, but we're going to give it a shot. So before I power this flash on, I want to lower my exposure by 1 stop so that we can get a correct exposure with the flash on. I'm going to lower my aperture from 5.6 to f8. So when I do add this direct flash, there's a few giant errors. As you can see in this shot, the light is coming from the ground, which is never flattering to the human face. There's just no shadows, there's no drama here. And because I'm turning this camera vertically for this specific composition, now the flash head is so far from the lens and so far to the side that it's creating these very strange shadows, and it's just not going to be a flattering light. So we obviously need to get this flash off camera, and one way to do that is with the TTL cable. It's a simple hardwired cable that allows me to shoot with my right hand and hold the flash in the other, so I have more control and can add a little bit more drama to this shot. So once I've attached this TTL cable, now it gives me the ability to take this light and extend it from arm's length and really take it and get some sort of different style of lighting. However, the problem is limiting to your arm length. Another problem is that I'm right-handed. I want to photograph Claire with my right hand and hold the speed light with my left hand, but unfortunately the light is sort of coming in from the right side of her face, so I have to switch my hands and awkwardly hold this camera with my left hand and the speed light with my right hand. And it's just not the best solution, but let's give it a try. So as you can see in this photo, even though the direction of the light has changed, which is a lot more flattering to Claire's face, it's still not a good shot. If you can remember from our natural light lesson with directional sunlight, there's a very pinpointed, precise direction that this light needs to fall, and my arm just isn't long enough to get there. So even though this cable doesn't exactly work for this particular scenario, I do want you to remember and keep in mind that this cable, I use it for almost every portrait that I shot within the first year of my photography. So even though I don't actually use this cable anymore, I still keep it in my bag because it is so reliable. So if we're not going to use this cable, at this point, we're going to introduce what most photographers use, which is wireless radio triggers, Pocket Wizard Plus 3s. And they give me the ability to fire this flash remotely. I have one on my camera and one attached to the flash. But with these units, I still have to manually change the power of the flash through the settings menu on the speed light. It might be a little less convenient, but I'm used to setting these flashes in manual anyway. And you're going to need to know that once we get in the studio. So the real reason why I introduced the Pocket Wizard Plus 3s is that it's going to give me the ability to place the light further than what my hand and my arm can reach. So since I work with Assistant, I'm going to have Hunter come in and we're going to put this speed light on a light stand, and he's going to hold this light exactly where it needs to be. So we have a simple small light stand here with an umbrella adapter that has a cold shoe where we can attach this speed light to this light stand. So now that I have the ability to place this light anywhere I want, I have to really consider where I want this light source to come from. Looking at the test frames that I've captured, I think that I need to follow the flow of the natural light and have this speed light fall on her at a nice 45-degree angle from camera right. Keep in mind, all of the techniques that we learned in natural light still apply here. So basically, I'm working with my own sun, and we can control it and place it to anywhere we want to really get a nice flattering light. So I'm going to have Hunter raise this light stand up to give him enough extension that we can put this light at that nice 45-degree directional angle. Okay, so this is pretty solid, but I'm going to have Hunter come around a little bit more so we can get that nice wrap around the face and get this light super dramatic to where it needs to be. So if you were to compare both of these images, the first image we captured is what we like to call split lighting. And split lighting is where you see a clear line down the center of a model's face that separates shadow from light. Personally, for this shot, I'm going to prefer a little bit more of the Rembrandt style lighting that we talked about in our earlier lessons. So I've had Hunter shift around and move the speed light a little bit towards me, and that's the kind of light that we're looking for in this particular scenario. So even though we've locked in our light, it's where I want it, there's still a glaring issue. These shadows are a little too hard, they're a little strong, and they just look unnatural. They don't look like it was lit by the sun. So what we want to do now is we want to introduce more ambient light into the frame. We want to bring up the natural light so that we're balancing both natural light and then the flash. So what we're going to do is we're going to raise the exposure on my camera by 2/3 of a stop, and we're going to lower the flash power by 2/3 of a stop. So now if you're to compare the shadows on their face, they're a lot less dense, and it looks a lot more natural here. This shot is a little bit more up my alley, where there's still those hard shadows in the wall. And so the one way that you can reduce those shadows is introducing that diffusion disc that we talked about in an earlier lesson. But what we're going to do is bring it in front of the speed light to modify the light so it makes it a lot softer, and we're going to completely reduce these hard shadows on the wall. So one thing you have to remember is that once we bring in this diffusion disc, it's going to eat up a lot of power. It's going to eat up a lot of stops of light. So we have to compensate for that by bringing up the flash power once again. So we've taken our flash power from 1/32 power to 1/16 power. So now Hunter's going to raise this diffusion disc at a nice 45-degree angle, and we're going to take a shot. Come over a little bit overhead, a little bit more. Open the mouth a little bit, Claire. Beautiful. So now that we have this light where I want it to be, we're going to work with the model, Claire, and we're going to try to get an awesome shot. Beautiful. Chin up a little bit. Let's look off camera slightly. There you go. Gorgeous. All right, look at me, straight at me. Good. Good. I'm going to bring that around a little bit more. Yeah. Great. It's great. Perfect. Chin up, even more. Good. So a few things you need to keep in mind is that you have the creative freedom of the position of the light, the hardness and softness of the light, as well as balancing both natural light and the artificial light. And so now I think I have the shot. Let's take it in post-processing.
We've got our next shot in front of us. I've already got it open, so let's jump in and I'll show you what I did in Capture One in Photoshop. I then pulled it into Capture One and I just did the same simple exposure adjustments that we've been doing for all the previous images. I brought down my highlights and I raised my shadows a little bit, and then I added just a little bit of contrast to even it out. The healing process for this image was a little bit more intensive just because of all this stuff going on in the background. But using the same techniques that I showed you in previous lessons, I was easily able to simplify the background. Next, I did some dodge and burn to even out the transitions on her face and on her legs. And finally, for color correction, there were a few areas of yellow that were a bit too eye-catching, so I desaturated those a little bit. To desaturate them, all I did was remove a little bit of yellow saturation in the yellow drop-down box here. You should know how to do what I just showed you, so let's move on and I'll show you two new things that you can use on your own images. The first thing that I'm going to show you is a quick technique to even out the tones of the skin. As you can see, her legs are looking a lot colder than her face, so we need to even out those skin tones. In a previous lesson, I showed you how to use the eyedropper to sample a color and paint it into a new area, but that's not going to work for this image because we're working with a larger area and want to keep some variation in the skin tone. Let me just show you real quick what it would look like if I did do that. We're going to make our color layer. Make sure that the blending mode is set to color. I'm going to make sure I'm using my brush tool by hitting B on the keyboard. I'll sample with the eyedropper tool. And let's try painting down here. You can see that it did improve the color, but it just doesn't look realistic. So instead of using this technique, I'm going to show you a better way to do it so it looks a lot more natural. We're going to delete this layer because we don't need it anymore. Let's zoom in on our face because that's where the good tones are. And we need to sample a good highlight tone from our face. Usually the forehead works best. So let's hold Option and sample a good highlight tone. And now we need to sample a good shadow tone. So we're going to hit X on our keyboard so we don't overwrite that last sample. And now let's sample in the shadow underneath her chin. Right about here should work. The reason I'm sampling a highlight and a shadow is because I want some good variation in all of the tones in between. So now that we have those tones picked, let's go ahead and go to our adjustment panel, and we're going to use gradient map. Let's call this skin color correction, skin CC. We're going to set it to color blend mode, and we're going to hit OK. So what this has done is that it's changed the entire image to the tones that we've selected. Obviously, this is way overboard, so let's back this off and bring back some of those natural colors. Let's try around 40% opacity. We'll zoom out a bit and check out how our legs look. Now this is still affecting the rest of the image, so let's invert this layer mask. Make sure we're using our brush tool and that we're painting with white. So I need to hit X on my keyboard. I'm going to increase my flow so I can paint it in a lot quicker. I'm going to reduce my brush size and I'm going to mask in some of that nice color. So that's looking pretty good. We fixed the color on the legs while still keeping it looking natural. Now that I'm looking, her fingers are a little bit cold looking as well. So we're going to zoom in on those. We're going to do the same thing that we did to the legs on her fingers. I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller. I'm just going to paint the effect in. It's super subtle, but I think that looks really good. The next trick that I'm going to show you is super useful, but we're not actually going to use it for this image. But still, this is something really useful that I want to teach you guys so you can use it on your own work. As an example, imagine you're shooting a product, but you only have one color of that product. Using the technique that I'm about to show you, you'll be able to change that one color into any other color. In this image, we're going to use the frills of her dress as the example. Our first goal to change the color is to isolate the area that we want to change. If the area we wanted to select was a completely different color, we could easily do that using hue and saturation. I'll show you how I would do it if these frills were, say, red. The first way that I'm going to show you is probably the hardest way to do it, but it gets the job done. I'm going to use the pen tool. To access the pen tool, you can hit P on your keyboard, or it's right here on your toolbar. The pen tool is similar to the lasso tool in the sense that you can make manual selections with it, but the pen tool has some additional features. The main being that you would make a point and then another point, and it would make a line between those 2 points. From there you can actually click and drag out. It'll make that line into a curve. Let me show you how I'm going to use this tool to select the frills, and I'll explain things as I go. So I'm going to undo that example I just did. We're going to zoom in. And I'm going to want to start by clicking around the edge of the frill. There's a bit of a curve right here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to click and drag. It's going to make the line curve along with the frill. So I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to click and drag, and click and drag. And we just want to make sure that line follows around the edge of the frill. This tool and technique will take a while to get used to, but I'm basically just going to keep clicking around this frill until I have the entire thing selected. I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to watch it for 10 minutes, and I'll explain what the next step is once I'm done. penning out her frills. The last step before you make your selection is to make sure that you connect your final dot to your first dot. We'll make our selection by hitting the selection button up here. I'm going to choose 1 radius, and I'm going to choose 1 pixel. And now we have our selection made. So I'm going to back up a bit. The first step to changing this color is to make a new layer with Command-Shift-N. I'm going to call it Frill Color. We're going to set the blend mode to multiply and hit OK. Now I'm going to put that layer into its own group by hitting Command-G. I'm going to name that group Frill, and I'm going to add the layer mask onto it. Since we had the frill selected, that's what our layer mask is going to be. We're going to choose our frill color layer, go up to Edit, Fill, select Color, and we're going to use a color right around here. So I'm going to hit OK, and OK again. Now it's filled our layer with that color. Let's back out a little bit. We're going to make a duplicate of this layer, and we're going to set this layer to color blend mode. This still needs a bit of work. We've lost a lot of contrast doing this, so now we need to add a curves layer and bring that contrast back. I'm going to add this curves layer in between the 2 color layers that we have. So I'm going to hit our bottom layer, click on curves, and I'm going to make a simple S curve to bring that contrast back. Now obviously this looks a little weird. The outfit was never made to have purple frills, it was made to be black and white. But this does show you a technique. An easier way to shift the color of an object is if it has a different color than anything else in the image. There is a way that is much easier to make a selection for a color change than what we just did, but in order to do it well, the area you're wanting to change needs to be different from all the colors around it. Now that our frills don't match any of the colors around it, I'll show you that technique. If I wanted to change the color of these purple frills, I would use a hue saturation adjustment. I would click on the master dropdown. I would choose greens because there aren't any in this photo really. I'm going to hit our eyedropper tool. I'm going to select this color. Now I can narrow our selection down even more by shifting these points around on the spectrum. So I'm going to move this over a little bit, about right there. Now let's see what happens when I move the hue slider. We're kind of catching some other areas because they're kind of the same color as our frills, but since they're not next to the frills, it's really easy to mask out. To make this selection, all I would need to do is invert my mask and then make a quick selection with my lasso tool. So I'm going to do that with Command-I to invert my layer mask, hit L to make sure we're using our lasso tool, and just draw around it really quickly. Now I'm going to hit Command-I again, and it'll invert only that selected area. Like I said before, this isn't actually what we want for our final image, so we're not going to keep any of these changes that we made. I just wanted to show you how to do it so you knew how. So I'm going to delete these last few layers to bring it back to white. And now this is ready to send off to Clay for his color grade.
With this shot, we have Claire in the alleyway. Because her arms are crossed, her pose, and just the overall feeling of the shot, I want to move into a cool direction with the color balance and the color tone. So the first thing we need to dive into is we need to create our base layer and build upon that. Once we have our base layer, we're going to convert this to a smart object so that we can create a non-destructive workflow and apply a smart filter of camera raw to this shot. And the only thing I want to do here is just bring the clarity up. Clarity is going to add a little bit of punch to this shot, as we discussed in previous lessons. Hit OK. Next, we're going to go up to curves and work on our color contrast. Now we're going to move into the red channel. I'm going to bring the reds significantly out of this shot. About right there. Next up, green. We're going to create a subtle S-curve here, adding a little bit of magenta and some green in the highlights. Once we have that subtle S-curve on the green channel, let's move into the blues. On the blue channel, the only thing that we want to do here is bring up some blue in the highlights. Once we have the color contrast applied, I want to move into vibrancy and just desaturate this image. Just to keep a consistent workflow among all these images, I'm going to pull this adjustment layer under the color contrast. Next, we're going to work on the midtones, and that's color balance. So I'm going to play with these sliders and really try to balance out the blue in this shot because it's overall very cool. So I want to balance this out to create a really interesting color tone here. So I'm going to bring up these reds. Maybe bring in the greens. Finally the blues. Awesome. We have a really nice balanced shot now. It's not too blue, it's not too warm. It's right in the middle. So with color balance, we've applied color to just the midtones. Now I want to apply color to just the shadows or just the highlights. And selective color is a great way to do that. So we're going to go up to the selective color adjustment layer. Then we're going to go to the color drop-down menu here. And I want to select blacks because the only thing I want to affect here is the blacks in this shot. We're going to move down to the yellow slider. And I'm going to drag this yellow down to about 10%. And what this does is adds a significant amount of blue to the blacks, as you can see in this before and after. And I could add a lot of blacks into the blacks, just like this, or I could take out the blacks just with these sliders. Same thing goes for the magenta. I can add a lot of magenta, or I can remove magenta by adding green into the shadows. And then same with cyan. I can add cyan or I can add red. This is also known as split toning or a split process. And you can do it within the selective color adjustment layer. Once we have our selective color adjustment layer applied, we're going to move into my sharpening process. My sharpening process has been applied, so next I'm going to move into noise. Once I have my noise applied, we're going to create another layer so I can go in with some final touches on camera raw and just move those temperature sliders to create a nice white balance as a final adjustment. So I'm just shifting these temperature sliders as I did in the last shot, just to find that last little touch of color that's going to make this shot just that much better. Here you can also play with the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Once you have a nice balanced color tone and you feel like this is it, you're going to hit OK. The last step is I want to elongate Claire's body by pulling these pixels a little bit and transforming this shot. And to do that, I want to create a new layer because we don't want to work off this smart object. Once I have that new layer created, I want to hit Command T or Control T for the free transform tool. And I'm going to pull this shot up just a hair and hit Enter. We've elongated Claire's face, elongated her body. Once again, it's important that you save this out and rest your eyes because you might come back to this shot and completely change the color. It might look completely different to you. So now that we have this shot complete, we're going to move on.